Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today. I'm pleased to be here with Rick McIver, our Minister of Municipal Affairs, to announce new measures to defend our provincial jurisdiction. For years now, even though the Liberal government in Ottawa has had the barest of representation in our province, they've been imposing their destructive agenda on Alberta taxpayers. We see this as Alberta Liberals enacting policies that will devastate our province's economy. We see this when they fail to provide Alberta with our fair share of per capita program funding. And we see this when they actively work around us to sign funding agreements with municipalities and provincially regulated and funded organizations that run counter to Alberta's interests and priorities. Section 92 of the Constitution states that municipalities fall within the exclusive jurisdiction of the provinces. The terms could not be more clear or more certain. And yet, as we've come to see far too often, the federal government extends itself too far and interferes in our provincial jurisdiction. And we aren't the only province to see this and be troubled by it. Last November, during our Council of the Federation meeting in Halifax, premiers across the country were united in opposing Ottawa's practice of stepping over our provincial governments to make agreements directly with municipalities. And many of us spoke about pursuing legislation similar to what is in existence in Quebec, which prohibits the federal government from bypassing the provincial government when making deals with municipalities. In fact, the Quebec minister made sure that we all had a copy of that legislation before we left that day. So today, this is no longer just talk in Alberta. Today, we are taking back more of our jurisdictional control and telling Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his cabinet that they cannot make deals without our express approval. And this afternoon, I'm pleased to table the Provincial Priorities Act to do just that. Albertans are uninterested in the virtue signaling from Ottawa and the related strings that come with this. We are interested in our fair share of federal funding to move forward with our priorities on roads, on infrastructure, and on housing. Now, let's be clear, when we talk about federal funding, we mean money that comes from Canadian taxpayers. For much of our recent history, Albertans have paid far more in federal taxes than we get back in federal programs and transfers. Even during the last economic downturn, one of the worst in our history, we were still the largest net contributor to federal finances. And yet we consistently receive less than our provincial neighbours in per capita funding. And when we do receive funding, those federal dollars come with ideological strings attached, offering funding on its own terms, bypassing the provinces, and forcing municipalities to dance to Ottawa's tune, like funding for so-called safe supply, or electric buses that don't work, or solar and wind projects when we need reliable baseload power, or what we're seeing with the games being played over the housing accelerator funds. In other cases, Ottawa ignores programs already in place and wastefully spends on duplicative programs like pharmacare and dental care, when what we really need is envelope funding to expand existing provincial programs that already exist in these areas. Funding for what Alberta's priorities are that we need. Federal interference, we don't. Ottawa should be staying in its own lane. But at the end of the day, I think I know what's happening. Justin Trudeau has said his job is boring. Well, I'll suggest that's because he doesn't actually know what his job is, and therefore he isn't doing it. Because if he were doing his job, he wouldn't have enough time to meddle in my ability to do my job and the ability of other premiers to do their jobs. So here is a partial list of the things he and his government are not doing that they could and should do instead of interfering in provincial matters. He should get rid of the consumer carbon tax. He should fund on-reserve housing and health care. He should close the gap in funding for on-reserve addiction treatment for First Nations. He should provide per capita funding for housing and road infrastructure. He should collaborate to build strong economic corridors. He should develop an aggressive plan on international trade to get our natural resources to market, including a strategy to transport hydrogen and ammonia for export. He should bring in the clean energy investment tax credit that he has promised, including for carbon capture utilization and storage. He should address public safety concerns resulting from their lenient bail system. He should manage federal finances, deficits, and debt in order to combat the inflation that is squeezing every Canadian today. So if I ran through the full list of things that are in federal jurisdiction that they are not doing, we'd be here all afternoon. But these examples clearly show that Ottawa is neglecting its own responsibilities while meddling needlessly in ours. Albertans don't want federal funding to show the world how virtuous we are or to polish Canada's halo internationally. We want our provincial share of per capita federal funding for roads, for infrastructure, and for housing. Projects that will make a real difference for Albertans. The way we see it, federal and provincial funding should be spent collaboratively, not at cross purposes. And it should be spent on Alberta's priorities and not on Ottawa's, because after all, a lot of that money came from hardworking Alberta taxpayers in the first place. But this federal government has never let reality get in the way of a good headline and never missed an opportunity to grab more control from the provinces. Our government believes Albertans are entitled to their fair share of federal funding and to have that funding spent on priorities that matter to them. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure that happens, including through this legislation, which signals that Alberta will act to ensure the Constitution's integrity and that we won't put up with any further manipulation or political interference from Ottawa.